Tonight, you will fall asleep in a room held at exactly the temperature you chose. You will pull a blanket over yourself, and within minutes, your core temperature will stabilize at around 36.5 degrees Celsius. Your brain will cycle into slow-wave sleep. You will not negotiate with the cold. You will not calculate whether your body can survive the next 6 hours without moving. Your only decision will be whether to keep scrolling or close your eyes. That experience, falling asleep because you are warm enough to, is one of the newest luxuries in the entire history of your species. For approximately 2.5 million years, the genus Homo has existed on this planet. And for the vast majority of that time, a stretch so long that all of recorded human history fits inside the last fraction of 1%, sleep was not something the night guaranteed. It was something the night threatened. A negotiation between your body's desperate requirement for unconsciousness and an atmosphere that was, for enormous stretches of evolutionary time, cold enough to kill you before dawn. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, ice sheets up to 3 kilometers thick covered most of northern Europe and North America. That is a wall of ice taller than 8 Eiffel Towers stacked on top of each other, stretching from what is now New York City to the edge of the Canadian Arctic. Average global temperatures sat 5 to 10 degrees Celsius below modern levels, but local conditions in the periglacial zones, the regions just south of the ice sheets where humans actually lived, were far worse. Winter nights could plunge to minus 40 degrees. At that temperature, exposed skin develops frostbite in under 10 minutes. Moisture inside your nostrils freezes when you inhale. Your body begins losing core heat faster than its metabolism can generate it. And yet, humans were there, not just surviving, expanding, pushing north into landscapes where no primate had any evolutionary business existing. The part of the Ice Age story that rarely gets told is the nights. The days were brutal, but during daylight hours, movement was possible. Hunting, foraging, the raw caloric burn of physical activity kept body temperatures above the threshold of hypothermia. Nights were different. At night, you stopped moving. You lay down. Your metabolic rate dropped. And the cold, which had been held at bay by exertion, closed in around you like water filling a hole. The question is not whether ancient humans survived the cold. They obviously did. You are the proof. The question is what they actually did when the sun disappeared, the temperature plunged, and sleep became biologically dangerous. The answer involves fire, obviously. But fire was only the beginning. What came after? The engineering, the chemistry, the social strategies, and the accidental discovery of fermented substances that would eventually reshape human civilization is a story that connects the frozen nights of the Pleistocene directly to the warm bed you are lying in right now. The most obvious answer is fire, and fire was, without question, the first and most critical tool in the cold survival arsenal of ancient humans. But the relationship between fire and sleep is more complicated than it sounds. Evidence for controlled fire use extends back at least 400,000 years, and possibly much further. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa's northern Cape Province, archaeologist Peter Beaumont and a later team led by Michael Chazan of the University of Toronto identified burned bone fragments and concentrated ash deposits suggesting controlled burning approximately 1 million years ago. At Qesem Cave in Israel, researchers from Tel Aviv University documented repeated fire use in the same location over a span of roughly 200,000 years. These were not brush fires blown in by wind. The ash deposits were concentrated in specific locations associated with tool making and food processing areas. Someone chose where to build those fires and returned to the same hearth positions again and again. But here is the detail that changes the picture entirely. Fire in the Paleolithic was not a thermostat you could set and ignore. A fire hot enough to warm a group of sleeping humans through a sub-zero night required constant feeding, consistent fuel supply, and an intuitive grasp of airflow dynamics that most modern campers would struggle with. In glacial Europe, fuel itself was a crisis. The periglacial landscape was tundra steppe, vast and treeless, dominated by grasses and low scrub. Dense forests had retreated south. Humans burned mammoth bone, which contains enough fat to sustain slow combustion. They burned dried animal dung, They burned whatever woody scrub the wind had not stripped away. Every piece of fuel had to be gathered during scarce daylight hours, transported to the sleeping site, and rationed through the long darkness. Archaeological evidence from Upper Paleolithic sites across Europe reveals sophisticated fire management. At Dolní Věstonice in the modern Czech Republic, a site dating to approximately 29,000 years ago, excavations led by Bohuslav Klima uncovered multiple hearth structures arranged inside the living area. Some were clearly designed for cooking, others were positioned against limestone walls where their radiant heat would reflect back toward sleeping areas. The placement was deliberate thermal engineering, using the rock itself as a heat mirror to concentrate warmth where bodies lay. But even well-managed fires left a gap. Fires die. Fuel runs out. Someone falls asleep on watch, and the flames drop to embers, and the embers cool to ash, and by 3 in the morning, the temperature inside the shelter is barely different from the temperature outside. The hours between midnight and dawn, the deepest trough of a winter night, were the most dangerous. And it was during those hours that ancient humans deployed survival strategies that had nothing to do with flame. If you want the complete system behind ancient human survival, every strategy and adaptation broken down in one place, it is all compiled in the ebook. The link is in the description below, but right now the fire is burning low, and we need to talk about what came after it. The first line of defense beyond fire was architecture, and the architecture of Paleolithic cold-weather shelters was far more sophisticated than the word cave implies. Caves were used, certainly. Limestone cave systems across southern France, northern Spain, and the Dordogne Valley provided natural insulation and wind protection that no constructed shelter could match. Deep limestone caves maintain remarkably stable temperatures year-round, typically hovering between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius regardless of outside conditions. For humans facing -40 on the surface, a cave interior at 12 degrees represented a swing of more than 50 degrees before anyone struck a spark. Combine that with a well-placed fire reflecting heat off stone walls, and a cave sleeping area could reach temperatures that allowed the body to enter sleep without the constant metabolic emergency of shivering. But caves are geological accidents. They exist where the rock allowed them to form, not where humans needed them. And Paleolithic life required movement, following migrating herds of reindeer, bison, and mammoth across open landscapes where no natural shelter existed. In those environments, humans built their own. At Mezhyrich in central Ukraine, archaeologists discovered some of the most extraordinary dwellings in the Paleolithic record. Dating to approximately 15,000 years ago, these structures were constructed almost entirely from the bones of woolly mammoths. Jaw bones formed the base. Massive leg bones and shoulder blades were stacked and interlocked in patterns that required planning and communal labor. Tusks arched overhead as structural supports. The entire framework was covered with layered animal hides and sealed with packed earth and clay. Some of these dwellings measured nearly 5 meters across, enough to shelter an extended family group comfortably. Inside, hearth pits showed evidence of sustained fire use, with fuel residue indicating that mammoth bone itself served as the primary combustible. The dense walls of stacked bone, some structures incorporated the remains of nearly 100 individual mammoths, blocked wind with a mass that high tents could never achieve. The packed earth fill between bones created dead air pockets, the same insulation principle that modern double-pane windows exploit. These were not improvised camps. The sheer investment of labor, the weeks required to gather, transport, and assemble hundreds of kilograms of bone into a functional structure, tells us these were engineered for one purpose above all others: surviving winter nights. But shelter and fire together still left the body exposed, because the human body itself was the real problem. Homo sapiens is a tropical machine. Your species evolved in equatorial Africa, in an environment where nighttime temperatures rarely dropped below 15 degrees Celsius. Your body is optimized for shedding heat, not retaining it. You sweat with extraordinary efficiency. You carry far less body hair than any other primate your size. Your limbs are proportionally long, maximizing surface area for heat dissipation. Every feature that makes you well adapted for the African savanna makes you catastrophically vulnerable to a glacial European winter. When that tropical body attempts to sleep in a sub-zero environment, the thermodynamic math becomes terrifying. Core temperature must remain between approximately 36 and 38 degrees Celsius. Drop below 35 and hypothermia begins. Below 32, cardiac rhythm destabilizes. Below 28, death becomes likely. Every degree of heat lost must be replaced by metabolic activity, external warming, or insulation. And during sleep, the problem intensifies. Metabolic rate drops by roughly 15%. Muscle activity ceases. The body's primary heat engine slows just as the demand for warmth peaks. This is where clothing technology becomes a matter of life and death. And not just any clothing. The distinction between draped and tailored is the distinction between dying before dawn and waking to see the sunrise. Ian Gilligan, an archaeologist at the University of Sydney, published research in 2010 arguing that the development of fitted garments was one of the most critical innovations in human survival history. A hide draped over the shoulders leaves gaps at the wrists, the neck, the waist, openings where body heat escapes in convective plumes, and frigid air rushes in against the skin. A fitted garment, one sewn to conform to the body's shape using needle and sinew thread, traps a layer of still air between skin and material. That trapped air is the insulation. It slows conductive heat loss by orders of magnitude compared to an open drape. The tool that made tailored clothing possible was the bone needle. And bone needles appear in the archaeological record approximately 40,000 to 50,000 years ago. At Denisova Cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia, excavations have recovered some of the oldest known examples dating to roughly 50,000 years ago. These are not crude spikes. They are thin, polished, and feature drilled eyes for threading animal sinew or plant fiber. The craftsmanship required to produce them, shaping bone to a point fine enough to pierce hide without tearing it, drilling a hole barely a millimeter wide through dense material, suggests that needle-making was already a refined skill when those earliest surviving examples were produced. Think about what that means for a moment. Before the bone needle, no human could sew. Without sewing, there were no fitted garments. Without fitted garments, body heat losses during a winter night in periglacial Europe would have overwhelmed any fire or shelter. The bone needle did not just make clothing possible. It made sleep possible in environments where sleep without insulation was a death sentence. But even inside tailored furs, inside a mammoth bone dwelling, beside a burning hearth, the cold still found its way through. And this is where the human body itself had one more adaptation to offer. Brown adipose tissue, commonly known as brown fat, is a specialized fat cell that generates heat directly through a process called non-shivering thermogenesis. Unlike white fat, which stores energy for later use, brown fat burns energy specifically to produce warmth. Newborn humans carry significant deposits of brown fat because they cannot shiver effectively. Adults retain smaller amounts, concentrated around the neck, shoulders, and upper back. In 2009, a series of studies published in the New England Journal of Medicine confirmed that adult humans still possess metabolically active brown fat, and that cold exposure activates it. Populations with long evolutionary histories in cold climates show enhanced brown fat function. The Inuit of the Arctic demonstrate metabolic signatures consistent with elevated non-shivering thermogenesis, their bodies generating internal heat during cold exposure without the energy-draining muscular contractions of shivering. There is also a striking observation recorded by physiologist P.F. Schulander in the 1950s. Scholander and colleagues studied indigenous Australians who routinely slept outdoors in the central Australian desert, where nighttime temperatures dropped to around 5 degrees Celsius. The subjects slept between small fires, wearing minimal clothing. Their skin temperature dropped significantly through the night. But their core temperature remained stable, and they slept soundly. European control subjects in identical conditions shivered violently and could not sleep at all. The Aboriginal subjects' bodies had adapted to allow peripheral cooling while fiercely protecting the vital core. They had, over generations of cold exposure from birth, recalibrated the threshold at which their biology permitted sleep. This tells us something important about Paleolithic cold survival. The question is not only how ancient humans stayed warm enough to sleep, it is also how they redefined what warm enough meant. Modern humans calibrated to heated rooms feel cold at 18 degrees and call 10 degrees unbearable. Those thresholds are not biological absolutes. They are cultural products of insulated housing and central heating. A Pleistocene hunter raised in periglacial Europe, cold exposed from infancy, carried a tolerance that would seem superhuman by modern standards. What would constitute an emergency for you was, for them, simply what night felt like. But adaptation and tolerance alone could not carry a population through Ice Age winters. The cold was too deep, the nights too long, for any single strategy to work alone. And this is where a behavior pattern emerges that the modern world has almost entirely forgotten, a sleep architecture so different from your nightly 8-hour block that physicians today routinely diagnose it as a disorder when fragments of it surface. In 2001, historian A. Roger Eckerch of Virginia Tech published a landmark paper, followed in 2005 by a book titled At Day's Close, Night in Times Past, documenting something that had been hiding in plain sight across centuries of historical evidence. Before the Industrial Revolution and the spread of artificial lighting, humans did not sleep in one continuous block. They slept in two distinct phases. First sleep began shortly after dark and lasted roughly 4 hours. Then the sleeper woke, not from a nightmare, not from discomfort. The waking was natural, anticipated, and culturally embedded. The period of wakefulness that followed, sometimes called the watch, lasted 1 to 2 hours. Then the sleeper returned to bed for a second sleep that carried through to dawn. Eckerch identified references to this pattern in more than 500 historical sources, spanning from ancient Greek literature to medieval court records to 19th century medical texts. First sleep and second sleep were common terms across multiple European languages for centuries. The behavior was so universal that nobody thought to remark on it. It was simply how people slept. Psychiatrist Thomas Ware of the National Institute of Mental Health provided experimental confirmation in 1993. When Ware placed subjects in conditions mimicking natural winter light exposure, with 14 hours of darkness per night, they spontaneously shifted to biphasic sleep within weeks. 4 hours of sleep, then a waking period characterized by elevated prolactin levels, and a meditative, almost trance-like mental clarity, then 4 more hours of sleep. The implications for Paleolithic humans are direct. During glacial winters, when darkness lasted 16 hours or more, humans were almost certainly not attempting to sleep through the entire period. They woke between phases. And during those waking hours, in the cold dark of the shelter's interior, they did the things that kept them alive until the second round of sleep arrived. They fed the fire, they checked on sleeping children, adjusting hides and pulling small bodies closer to the heat. They ate. And the eating was not incidental. It was, in its own way, thermal engineering. The thermic effect of food is a well-documented physiological phenomenon. When you digest a meal, your body generates heat as a metabolic byproduct of breaking down nutrients. High-protein and high-fat foods produce the greatest thermic response, raising core body temperature measurably for hours after consumption. For humans trying to survive the coldest hours of a glacial night, a midnight meal of calorie-dense food was not just nutrition, it was combustion. Internal fuel, stoking the body's own furnace at exactly the moment the external fire was losing its battle with the cold. But securing calorie-dense food in the middle of winter posed its own challenge. Fresh meat froze, fresh plant material was unavailable for months. Food gathered during warmer seasons needed to last through the long freeze, and simple storage was unreliable. Frozen meat could sustain a group, but thawing and cooking it required fire and fuel, both scarce. There had to be a food technology that preserved nutrition, enhanced caloric density, and required little or no cooking. There was, and it was ancient. Fermentation. The process by which microorganisms, bacteria and wild yeast, convert sugars into alcohol and organic acids, transforming the chemical environment of food into one hostile to the pathogens that cause rot and disease. The lactic acid produced during fermentation drops pH to levels where Clostridium botulinum and Salmonella cannot survive. The ethanol produced during alcoholic fermentation carries its own antimicrobial properties. Together, these byproducts create a chemical barrier that extends the usable life of perishable food by weeks, sometimes months. Anthropologist John Spieth at the University of Michigan published research in 2017 documenting how critical fermentation was for foraging populations in northern climates. Speth argued that in environments where cooking fuel was scarce and temperatures limited fire maintenance, fermentation functioned as external digestion. Microorganisms broke down complex proteins and fats before the food entered a human stomach, reducing the metabolic energy required for digestion and making nutrients bioavailable that raw or frozen food could not deliver. Fermented food was also nutritionally superior to its unfermented form. The fermentation process degrades phytic acid, a compound that binds minerals and blocks their absorption in the gut. It synthesizes B vitamins, particularly folate and riboflavin. It populates the food with live bacterial cultures that support immune function and digestive health. A portion of fermented grain or meat was measurably more nutritious, calorie for calorie, than the same food eaten fresh. For a band of humans waking between first and second sleep in a mammoth bone shelter, reaching into a cached store of fermented provisions and eating in the firelight, the benefits stacked. More calories absorbed per bite. More metabolic heat generated during digestion. Better nutrient extraction from limited food stores. Less fuel needed for cooking. And the food itself remains safe to eat weeks or months after preparation, precisely because the fermentation had made it inhospitable to the bacteria that would otherwise make it lethal. And if that fermented food happened to contain ethanol, the effect deepened further. Because the human body's ability to process ethanol is not a recent cultural acquisition. It is an ancient molecular inheritance, and the story of how it arrived in your genome connects directly to the survival pressures of a cooling planet. In 2014, paleogeneticist Matthew Kerrigan at the Foundation for Applied Molecular Evolution in Gainesville, Florida, published a study in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that changed how evolutionary biologists understand the human relationship with alcohol. Kerrigan and biologist Stephen Benner sequenced ADH4 proteins, the enzymes responsible for metabolizing ethanol, from 19 modern primate species. Then they reconstructed the ancestral versions of those enzymes stretching back 70 million years through the primate family tree. For tens of millions of years, the ADH4 enzyme in arboreal primates was nearly useless against ethanol. It could break down other plant alcohols, but ethanol barely registered. Then, approximately 10 million years ago, a single amino acid substitution occurred in the common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. That one mutation made ADH4 40 times more efficient at processing ethanol, 40 times. Kerrigan's team confirmed the result by resurrecting the ancient enzyme variants in bacteria and testing them directly against ethanol. The timing was not coincidence. Around 10 million years ago, the planet was cooling. Forests were contracting. The common ancestor of the African great apes was transitioning from canopy life to ground life. And on the forest floor, ripe fruit does not hang on branches waiting to be picked. It falls, sits in the heat, and ferments. Yeast colonizes the sugars. The fruit becomes mildly alcoholic. The primates who could digest that fermenting fruit gained access to a calorie source that competitors could not tolerate. More energy per meal, more survival. That mutation is still inside every cell in your body. Every time your system processes ethanol without shutting down, you are running molecular machinery that was selected for on the floor of a shrinking African forest 10 million years before anyone carved a drinking vessel. If you are finding this useful, hit subscribe. Every week, this channel covers the science and archaeology behind events that shaped your species long before recorded history began. Subscribe now so the algorithm keeps showing you this content. Now here is why that enzyme matters for the story of cold and sleep. By the time Homo sapiens was pushing into glacial Europe, the ability to consume and metabolize fermented food was already millions of years old. It was not something ancient humans had to learn. It was something their bodies already knew how to do. And in cold climates, fermented foods offered a specific combination of advantages that unfermented foods could not match. Robert Dudley, a professor of integrative biology at the University of California, Berkeley, formalized this in 2000 with what he called the drunken monkey hypothesis. Dudley argued that human attraction to ethanol is not a cultural invention. It is an evolutionary inheritance. For frugivorous primates whose diet centered on fruit, ethanol was a signal molecule. When yeast fermented the sugars in ripe fruit, it produced volatile ethanol that dispersed into the surrounding air. In a dense tropical forest where food was scattered and hidden by canopy, the scent of ethanol was a beacon. Follow it, and you find calories. But ethanol itself carried caloric value, 7 calories per gram of ethanol versus 4 per gram of carbohydrate. A primate consuming fermenting fruit extracted nearly twice the energy per bite compared to one eating fresh fruit. In an environment where calories were scarce and competition fierce, that metabolic edge translated directly into survival advantage. In 2022, the hypothesis received direct experimental confirmation. A study published in Royal Society Open Science by Christina Campbell and colleagues documented wild spider monkeys on Barro Colorado Island in Panama, deliberately seeking out and eating fruit from the jabo tree, with ethanol concentrations between 1 and 2%. Urine samples from 5 of 6 studied monkeys contained secondary metabolites of ethanol. The monkeys were not encountering alcohol by accident. They were targeting it, consuming it routinely, and extracting energy from it as a standard part of their foraging behavior. For Ice Age humans, the caloric premium of fermented food was amplified by cold. Every additional calorie consumed generated additional metabolic heat during digestion. Fermented provisions, pre-digested by microbial action and calorie-dense by chemistry, provided precisely the thermal fuel that a sleeping body needed during the coldest hours. In a landscape where gathering fresh food in winter was dangerous or impossible, cached fermented stores were the margin between making it through the night and waking with a core temperature that had slipped below the point of recovery. There is a further dimension here, and it explains something about those waking hours between first and second sleep that pure thermodynamics cannot. Ethanol, even in the low concentrations found in naturally fermented foods, produces vasodilation. Blood vessels near the skin's surface widen. Warm blood flows closer to the surface. The sensation is warmth, a flush of heat that spreads across the face, the chest, the extremities. It is an illusion in one sense. Vasodilation actually accelerates heat loss from the core by moving warm blood closer to cold air. But in a shelter with ambient temperatures well above lethal thresholds, the subjective experience of warmth was genuine comfort. And comfort in a world with almost none was not a luxury, it was a psychological survival tool. Because the cold was not only a physical problem, it was a social one. And the role fermented food and mild ethanol played in holding groups together through Ice Age winters may have been as important as its caloric contribution. Edward Slingerland, a philosopher and cognitive scientist at the University of British Columbia, published a book in 2021 titled Drunk: How We Sipped, Danced, and Stumbled Our Way to Civilization. His argument was carefully researched and quietly radical. Alcohol, Slingerland proposed, is not an evolutionary mistake, it is a social technology, one that solved a problem no other tool could address. The problem was trust. Humans evolved in small bands of closely related individuals where cooperation was enforced by kinship and face-to-face reputation tracking. But as climate pressures forced unrelated groups to share shelter, share fire, and share food caches during harsh glacial winters, the old trust mechanisms broke down. You cannot rely on kinship to govern cooperation when half the people in your mammoth bone dwelling arrived from a band you have never encountered before. Ethanol suppresses activity in the prefrontal cortex, the brain region responsible for self-monitoring, analytical caution, and impulse control. When the prefrontal cortex is dampened, people become more open, more emotionally expressive, more willing to share, and less guarded about their true intentions. Slingerland described this as the costly signal theory of intoxication. When you are mildly intoxicated, you cannot easily fake emotions or conceal motives. The very impairment that makes alcohol risky also makes it honest. A person willing to lower their cognitive defenses in your presence is demonstrating vulnerability. And vulnerability, across evolutionary time, is one of the most reliable trust signals a primate can offer. Now picture a glacial winter night inside one of those mammoth bone shelters on the East European plain. 15 humans huddled in a space 5 meters across. A fire burning low at the center, its light catching the curved surfaces of interlocked tusks overhead. Some of these people are family. Some are strangers, members of another band who joined this group when resources contracted and solitary survival became impossible. The temperature outside is minus 35 degrees Celsius, cold enough that leaving the shelter unprotected for 20 minutes could be fatal. Between first and second sleep, the group wakes, Someone feeds bone fragments into the hearth. Someone passes a vessel of fermented mare's milk or a portion of grain mash that has been sitting in a skin pouch for weeks. The sugar's long converted into lactic acid and trace ethanol. The drink is sour, thick, perhaps 2% alcohol by volume. Less than a modern light beer. But the social effect is measurable. Inhibitions soften. Conversation loosens. The strangers around the fire begin to feel less like competitors and more like allies. Stories are told. Laughter breaks through the cold. The waking period between sleeps becomes, briefly, something other than a survival calculation. It becomes a communal experience. And this is not romantic speculation. Virtually every human culture that has independently discovered alcohol has incorporated it into social rituals. Diplomatic negotiations, peace agreements, marriage ceremonies, funerary rites, business transactions. The pattern is identical across continents and millennia. When humans need to establish trust quickly with people they do not know well, they drink together. The behavior is so universal that its absence in a culture is the exception, not the norm. Slingerland concluded that civilization itself would not have been possible without intoxication. The large-scale cooperation required to build permanent settlements, coordinate collective hunts across vast territories, and share resources through brutal winters depended on a chemical shortcut that could override the tribal suspicion hardwired into a primate brain never designed for anonymous collaboration. Alcohol did not just warm the body, it warmed the social space between strangers enough to make shared survival possible. But trust was only half of the psychological challenge facing ancient humans on glacial nights. The other half was dread. Consider the psychological reality of Pleistocene existence. Infant mortality exceeded 50% in some populations, meaning more than 1 in every 2 children born would not reach adulthood. Starvation was seasonal. Predation was constant. Injuries that would be trivial today, a broken leg, a deep laceration, and an infected tooth, were frequently fatal. Winter concentrated all of these threats into a months-long crucible of darkness, cold, and scarcity. You watched people you loved die. You carried the awareness that the same fate was coming for you, and there was almost nothing you could do about it except endure. Modern humans have built elaborate systems to buffer that awareness. Healthcare, emergency services, insulated shelter, the ambient knowledge that someone will help if things go wrong. Paleolithic humans had none of those systems. What they had was ritual. And ritual, across virtually every documented culture in the archaeological and ethnographic record, involved some form of fermented consumption. The psychopharmacological effects of ethanol, anxiety reduction, emotional openness, mild euphoria, and intensified social bonding are precisely the effects that would counteract the chronic psychological stress of surviving a Pleistocene winter. A group waking between sleeps to share fermented food in the firelight of a bone-walled shelter was not escaping reality. It was engaging in collective emotional processing, using a chemical tool to temporarily reduce the cognitive weight of consciousness in a world where full awareness was often agonizing. The evidence from Natufian burial sites in the Levant supports this interpretation directly. At Rakafet Cave in the Carmel Mountains near Haifa, Israel, archaeologist Lee Low of Stanford University published a study in 2018 in the Journal of Archaeological Science that pushed the origins of deliberate beer production back thousands of years earlier than anyone had expected. Working with Donnie Nadel of the University of Haifa, Leo analyzed residue from 3 stone mortars found inside the cave. The mortars were approximately 13,000 years old. Inside them, starch granules and microscopic phytoliths showed unmistakable evidence of malting, mashing, and controlled fermentation. Wheat and barley had been deliberately brewed into beer by hunter-gatherers who had not yet begun farming. The beer would have been thick, sour, closer to a porridge than anything in a modern glass. It was cloudy, unfiltered, and almost certainly consumed while still actively fermenting. But the Natufians had developed a multi-step brewing process, sophisticated enough to leave chemical signatures detectable 13,000 years later. The part that keeps researchers up at night is the location. Rakafet Cave was not a home. There is no evidence of regular habitation. It was a graveyard. The Natufians buried their dead inside the cave, sometimes on beds of wildflowers, and next to the graves they brewed. Li Lu was direct about the implications. Making alcohol was not necessarily a result of agricultural surplus production. It was developed for ritual purposes and spiritual needs, at least to some extent prior to agriculture. The living brewed for the dead. The act of communal drinking in the presence of the buried was a technology for managing grief, for marking the boundary between the living and the lost, for acknowledging mortality without being crushed by it. Every civilization that followed developed its own version of this practice: the Irish wake, the Jewish Shiva, the ancient Greek symposium. The mechanism was always the same: gather the living, share the drink, process the loss, continue. And this ties back to the glacial nights in a way that is easy to miss. Winter was the season of death. More people died during winter months than in any other period, not only from cold exposure, but from starvation, infection, and the accumulated toll of months without adequate nutrition or sunlight. The long, dark hours between first and second sleep were not merely physically threatening. They were psychologically devastating. The fermented foods and mild ethanol consumed during the waking period between sleep phases were not just caloric supplements or social lubricants. They were coping mechanisms, chemical tools for a species smart enough to understand its own fragility, and afraid enough to need help, making the next sunrise feel reachable. So what did ancient humans actually do when it was too cold to sleep? They did everything. They built fires and fed them with mammoth bone and dried dung, positioning the flames against reflective rock faces to maximize radiant heat across the sleeping area. They engineered shelters from the skeletons of animals that outweighed them by a factor of 50, insulating the walls with layered hides and packed earth, creating thermal envelopes that turned the worst nights survivable. They sewed fitted clothing from animal skins using bone needles fine enough that modern reproductions require magnification to replicate, trapping layers of dead air against the body to hold heat where it mattered. They trained their physiology through lifelong cold exposure to tolerate conditions that would hospitalize a modern human within hours, recalibrating the body's thermostat until temperatures you would call dangerous were simply what night felt like. They slept in shifts: first sleep, then waking, then second sleep. A rhythm so deeply written into human neurobiology that it persisted for thousands of years after the ice retreated, documented in hundreds of historical sources across dozens of cultures, and only disappeared when artificial lighting convinced our brains that night was 8 hours long instead of 16. During the waking hours between those sleep phases, they ate calorie-dense fermented foods that generated metabolic heat through digestion. They pressed their bodies together, exploiting the simple physics of shared warmth. Archaeological evidence from multiple Paleolithic sites showing sleeping areas arranged in tight clusters, not because space was limited, but because thermal contact was survival. They passed around vessels of fermented liquid that loosened the psychological grip of the cold and turned a shelter full of frightened, semi-related strangers into something closer to a community. They told stories in the firelight, transmitting the oral knowledge that taught the next generation where to find food, how to read weather, which rivers flooded and when, information that was the difference between a lineage that persisted and one that vanished. The waking hours between first and second sleep were not wasted time, they were the hours when the tribe maintained itself. When fires were rebuilt, when children were tended, when food was shared, when bonds were forged, and when the accumulated grief of a species that understood death was processed communally through ritual, storytelling, and the shared warmth of a fermented drink. Every one of those strategies is still encoded in your behavior tonight: the craving for warm food when temperatures drop, the instinct to huddle close to the people you care about when the world feels hostile, the pull toward a drink at the end of a hard day, the way your body relaxes when someone tells a story in a low voice in a dim room. These are not random preferences. They are survival echoes, calibrated over hundreds of thousands of generations, in conditions that would kill you in a single night without them. The heated room you sleep in tonight is roughly 12,000 years old as an architectural concept. The fitted clothing in your closet traces its lineage to bone needles that appeared 50,000 years ago. The fermented food in your refrigerator relies on a biochemical process older than agriculture itself. And the pattern of waking in the middle of the night, the one your doctor might call insomnia, may be the oldest surviving sleep behavior your species ever practiced. It is not a malfunction. It is a remnant of the nights when waking up between sleep phases was the thing that kept the fire burning, the children warm, and the group alive. Your ancestors did not defeat the cold by being tougher than it. They defeated it by being more creative, more cooperative, and more willing to share warmth, fuel, food, and the quiet comfort of a sour, mildly fermented drink in the darkest hours of the longest nights their species has ever endured. The mechanisms inside you have not changed. Only the temperature has. If you want to see what else your ancestors engineered to survive a world that was actively trying to erase them, click the video on screen now.